Hey guys, tonight we're easing back into the 1800s, where the world moves a bit slower, the beds are lumpier, and insomnia is treated with ingredients that sound more like a pie recipe than medicine. You're in a small, flickering room lit by a single oil lamp. The fireplace is low, your socks are slightly damp, and your mattress is mostly hay. Outside, the wind groans like a ghost with seasonal affective disorder. And well, you're very much awake. Again, it's the middle of the 19th century and no one has invented melatonin gummies or white noise apps. There's no midnight doom scrolling, just you, the strange ticking of a wall clock shaped like Queen Victoria's face, and a kind of existential fatigue that feels eerily familiar. You close your eyes, open them again. Someone in the next room is snoring aggressively. Even the candle looks tired. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop your location and local time in the comments. I want to see where my fellow sleepyheads are tuning in from. Now dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge up the narrow stairs of a modest townhouse somewhere in the 1840s London. The wood creaks like it's trying to apologize for every step. Your room is tidy but grim. A bed with bolsters, a wash basin, and a window you regret opening the moment the night air slaps your face. Your landlady insists it's healthier that way. Something about miasmas and moral fortitude. In this age, people aren't exactly sure why they can't sleep. The word insomnia exists, but it's rarely used by your average milkman or governess. They might say you have nervous complaints or suffer from a wandering mind. Historians still argue whether sleeplessness was seen as a physical ailment or more of a spiritual failing. Either way, it's just past midnight, and you're wide-eyed in a room colder than your ex's farewell letter. The options for fixing this are limited. Warm milk is the gold standard. A mug gently heated on the stove, sometimes with a pinch of nutmeg if you're fancy. You sip it slowly, hoping it will do something. The science behind this tradition is a little shaky. It might be the tryptophan, or it might be the placebo effect. Either way, your stomach is warm, but your eyes are still stubbornly open. The bed is no help. Victorian mattresses are stuffed with straw or wool or whatever else happened to be lying around. The blankets weigh roughly the same as a small anvil, but they're scratchy and vaguely damp. And don't get too excited about pillows. They're stiff, overfilled, and more decorative than functional. If you roll over and get jabbed in the ear by a random feather quill, that's just part of the experience. Your room lacks insulation, which means you can hear everything. The neighbor's cat yowling, the factory bell in the distance, the dripping of something you're pretty sure isn't rain. You try covering your ears, but then your brain decides now's the perfect time to replay that awkward conversation you had 2 weeks ago. Classic. Still, not everything is grim. There's a kind of strange beauty in the quiet. The way shadows stretch across the ceiling like sleeping animals. The rustle of your wool blanket as you shift. Even the cold has a charm, like it's daring you to nestle deeper. You pretend you're hibernating. You're a particularly anxious bear with debt and a mild vitamin deficiency. And of course, there's always the midnight walk. You wrap yourself in your thickest shawl, light a candle and a glass lantern, and tiptoe outside. The cobblestones are slick with mist. A carriage clatters by in the distance. You pass other figures who might be walking for the same reason. Too awake, too alone, and too full of thoughts they can't quite name. In Victorian times, people didn't expect to sleep 8 hours straight. It was more common to have segmented sleep. You'd nod off for a few hours, wake around midnight, then drift off again. That middle-of-the-night wakefulness was often when people prayed, read, wrote letters, or just stared into the fireplace like melancholic raccoons. So maybe you're not broken. Maybe this is just how human beings used to do it. Wake up, ponder life, drink something hot, and hope round two comes soon. Still, you can't help but wish for something better. A remedy that doesn't taste like boiled cabbage. A bed that doesn't require acrobatics to get comfortable. A brain that lets you sleep without replaying your entire adolescence in vivid, cringy detail. But for now, you lie back down. The milk mug sits empty on the bedside table. The fire has faded to red coals. Your eyelids start to feel a bit heavier. Not from the milk, probably, but from sheer historical exhaustion. Maybe the cold is winning. Maybe your body finally gave up trying to be productive. You pull the blanket tighter and listen to the wind. You're still awake, but not for much longer. You sit up slightly, the blanket sliding down to your waist, and glance toward the little wooden cabinet near the bed. It's got a tiny drawer that squeaks if you breathe too hard near it. And tonight, it's hiding your next desperate hope for rest. A small tin labeled Elixir for Nightly Calm with nutmeg and laudanum. You sigh. Here we go again. Tonight's menu of 19th century sleep aids reads like the strange love child of a witch's apothecary and your grandmother's spice rack. You reach for the warm milk again, but this time it's been jazzed up, steeped with chamomile, sprinkled with nutmeg, maybe a dollop of honey if you're feeling decadent. Some people swear by lettuce water, which, yes, is literally boiled lettuce. Supposedly, the milky sap in lettuce has mild sedative properties. Mostly, it just tastes like disappointment. Still, you drink it. There's a certain comfort in these rituals, in the quiet clinking of porcelain, in the aroma of warm dairy and old wood. But let's not kid ourselves. These aren't miracle cures. They're sleepy time placebos, wrapped in a ribbon of Victorian optimism. Back then, doctors and wise women alike proposed all sorts of sleepy concoctions. Poppy syrup was a favorite, made from opium, of course, and spooned liberally into children's mouths by mothers who just needed a minute. Historians still argue whether this casual use of narcotics was born out of ignorance or simply a desperate, exhausted shrug. Either way, if you're imagining a time before the opioid crisis, think again. This was just the earlier version, served with a side of respectability and a bow. You try to remember if you've already taken your dose tonight. A few drops of laudanum swirled into water. It tastes bitter, like rotten perfume. Your body reacts slowly, not entirely convinced you didn't just drink someone's grandmother's cologne. You feel floatier. Not sleepy exactly. Just like your arms are now made of warm cloth and your thoughts are all trying to hum the same lullaby but in different keys. If you're lower class, these potions are home-brewed, passed down in murmured family recipes. If you're upper class, they're purchased from posh apothecaries in cobalt glass bottles with cursive labels and a price tag that screams, "You paid for the font, not the function." Everyone's drinking something, hoping it will pull the curtain of sleep down just a bit faster tonight. You curl back under the covers and try counting, something your great aunt insists helps. Not sheep, though. This is the 1800s. You count soft, repetitive sounds. A grandfather clock's ticks, the gentle drips from the ceiling corner, the way your heart thuds like a metronome with performance anxiety. But then the stomach rumbles. Did the milk clash with the opium again? You sit up and groan. Victorian indigestion is its own nightly event, especially since dinner probably involved something aggressively stewed and suspiciously beige. A small slice of toast might help, or maybe caraway seeds, another go-to for nocturnal discomforts. You chew them in the dark like a squirrel with a prescription. You hear your neighbor coughing through the thin walls, Mrs. Winslow, who claims to have cured her insomnia with a potion made from cloves, vinegar, and sheer spite. She's also been known to recommend sleeping with a raw onion under the pillow. Draws out the fevers, she says. Mostly it draws out the flies. In many homes, the line between medicine and superstition is blurry at best. Herbal teas made from valerian root or passion flower are treated with the same reverence as holy water. If you're Catholic, maybe a priest blessed your pillow. If you're spiritualist, you might burn some mugwort and chant softly in Latin. Whatever works, right? Historians still debate how much of this era's sleep culture was shaped by class, religion, and access to knowledge. Or if most people were simply winging it night after night, one weird recipe at a time. The truth probably lies somewhere in that woozy middle ground. where a little ginger steeped in hot water feels more like hope than actual science. You get up, again, and shuffle to the hearth, where a small kettle is keeping warm on the edge of the coals. You add a spoon of sugar to your mug, stir, and watch the swirl of milk fade into the liquid like a dream you're already forgetting. You sip. It's still not working, but it's a ritual, and rituals are soothing even when they're ineffective. Like whispering a bedtime story to your anxiety. Like bribing your own body with warm beverages and optimism, there's always the chance it kicks in later. Sometimes sleep isn't a single moment. It's a series of soft retreats, a slow undoing. You feel yourself leaning into it even as the ticking clock insists it's far too late, or too early for real rest. You wonder how many others are awake at this hour, cradling mugs, mumbling prayers, and hoping their eyes will finally close. You return to bed once more, heavier now, not from the milk, not from the laudanum, but from the small, weighted hope that maybe this time, maybe this moment, sleep will slip through the cracks and settle gently over your mind like fresh snow. You lie back, eyes closed, and wait. Your eyes are still closed, but you're not fooling anyone. You're awake again. Now, just with the faint aftertaste of nutmeg and vague betrayal on your tongue. The bed creaks as you shift for the 20th time like a bored ghost sighing beneath you. You pull the blanket up to your chin and try not to think about the window. You fail. The window is open, just slightly. A thin crack, letting in the kind of air that Victorian doctors would have called bracing, and you would call unwelcome. Still, everyone swears by it. Cold, clean air, they say, keeps the body pure and the lungs honest. You're not sure how honest your lungs are, but they certainly feel frigid. This is sleep hygiene, circa 1850. No foam mattresses, no essential oil diffusers, no sleep podcasts. Just heavy flannel, drafty rooms, and an almost religious commitment to the idea that fresh air cures everything, including, allegedly, your runaway brain. You curl deeper into the covers. Victorian sleepwear is not made for elegance. It's made for insulation. You're wrapped in a nightshirt that reaches your ankles and buttons all the way to your throat. Some nights you wear a cap to bed, not to be adorable, but to keep your ears from freezing off. And socks. Thick, itchy woolen socks that always end up halfway across the room by morning, like they've tried to escape your terrible circulation. The bed itself is an odd contraption. Ropes underneath the mattress that sag over time, needing regular tightening with a special key. Sleep tight, someone once said, and meant it literally. Above you, a canopy hangs, not for luxury, but to keep bugs, dust, and the occasional falling mouse from joining your slumber. Charming. And then, of course, there's the bedpan. Cold. Metal. Utterly terrifying. You try not to think about it, sitting there under the bed like a judgmental toad. You reach for the little lavender pouch tucked into the headboard. Dried lavender was considered calming, and while the scent has long since faded into a ghost of itself, you sniff it anyway. It's a comfort thing. Like tucking your chin just right against the seam of the pillow. Like pressing your thumb against the dented wood of the nightstand. A bedtime rosary for the terminally restless. For some Victorians, sleep was more than rest. It was a moral duty. Good sleep implied clean thoughts and a clean conscience. Bad sleep? Well, that meant something was wrong with you, inside. Sin, perhaps. Or hysteria. Or an imbalanced humor. Historians still argue whether Victorian sleep rituals were more about actual health or a performance of respectability. You weren't just meant to rest, you were supposed to rest properly. That meant no frivolity in the bedroom. Bedrooms were spare, somber, and orderly. No riotous color, no clutter, no piles of books or sentimental clutter. Just a crucifix, perhaps, a portrait of a stern-looking ancestor, maybe a single shelf with a Bible and a battered volume of Shakespeare. You weren't supposed to lounge, you were supposed to repose like a respectable corpse. It's no wonder people couldn't sleep. You sigh and kick one foot out of the blankets, instantly regret it, and pull it back in like a turtle. The air bites. Maybe the doctor was right. Maybe you need to try the thermal shock method. That's where you sit by a fire until you're toasty, then immediately plunge your feet into cold water. The idea is to confuse your body into giving up and passing out. You haven't tried it yet because you suspect it's just a creative form of torture. You glance at the chair in the corner. Some Victorians swore by pre-sleep sitting. You were meant to sit upright, eyes closed, for at least 15 minutes before even thinking about lying down. A sort of meditative pause. Tonight, the chair is draped with your daytime clothes. Corset, wool petticoat, high-collared blouse that whispers fashion but screams inflammation. You've never related more to a piece of furniture. In this world, even your sleeping position is a matter of heated debate. On your back, you risk bad digestion and possibly demonic dreams. On your side, better, but only the right side, or else your organs might sulk. Stomach sleeping? Barbaric. You settle on your right side, arm tucked under the pillow, spine curled just so. It's not comfortable, but at least you won't be judged by the invisible sleep police. You breathe deeply and try to think calming thoughts. A warm bath, a meadow, a world without scratchy linens. Your fingers twitch, your eyelids flutter. Maybe, just maybe, it's working. And then, the floorboard creaks. Not yours, not your room. Someone else is up. Maybe the lodger downstairs. Maybe your landlord, pacing like he always does when he drinks too much sherry. The creaking goes on. Slow, deliberate, like the footsteps of a man considering whether sleep is worth it or not. You lie there, completely still, listening. Then, silence. It's funny how shared sleeplessness connects people. In a strange way, you feel less alone knowing someone else is pacing. Someone else is trapped in their own thoughts, just like you. Someone else is cold, restless, and mildly annoyed by the sound of their own heartbeat. Eventually, the wind outside dies down. The fire in your hearth gives one last sigh before going quiet. You burrow deeper into the covers. The nightshirt shifts against your skin, stiff and vaguely damp, but not entirely awful. Your toes find each other, and finally your brain begins to slow. Maybe it's the air. Maybe it's the lavender. Maybe it's the ritual or the flannel, or the way the darkness now feels less like a weight and more like a quilt, pulled gently over the world. You exhale. Sleep doesn't come quickly, but it comes. You're floating somewhere between half-dream and half-consciousness when the dreaded bell tolls. An old brass clangor from the church tower down the lane. 3 slow chimes, each one dragging through the air like it knows exactly what it's doing. You open one eye. Still dark. Still very much awake. The milk has cooled into an unloved puddle on the bedside table. The fire's died down to dull orange crumbs. You turn over, which involves a full strategic retucking of your blanket, the kind of maneuver that would have earned you battlefield medals in other contexts. Your back now faces the drafty window. Your face smashes gently into the pillow seam. You try to believe this new position will change something. Spoiler, it doesn't. If the milk failed and the nightshirt's offering no miracles, you consider what every 19th century insomniac eventually does. Physical remedies. Stretching, rubbing, self-massage using oils that smell suspiciously like salad dressing. There's a half-used tin of camphor salve on your bedside table, which you're supposed to rub into your temples to chase away excitability. All it does is make your eyes water and your pillow smell like a carpenter's workshop. Victorian medical books also recommend light exercise before bed. Stimulate the circulation, they say. So you rise, begrudgingly, and do 3 awkward toe touches in the darkness, your joints cracking like a haunted music box. You pause. Try a squat. regret it instantly. You sit back down on the edge of the bed, breathless and cold, and rethink everything. Historians still argue whether these bedtime calisthenics were genuinely helpful, or just another attempt to moralize sleep through effort and bodily control. The Victorians loved discipline, in work, in emotions, in digestion, and that extended right to bedtime. You weren't just supposed to sleep. You were supposed to deserve it. You flop back into bed, limbs flailing like a distressed starfish, and think about Dr. Alexander Wood, one of the earliest champions of sleep through body discipline. He advised sleeping on hard surfaces and waking at dawn for a brisk walk. You wonder if he ever tried it himself, or if he was one of those people who just fell asleep easily, the worst kind. Of course, you could also try distraction techniques. These were all the rage among the upwardly restless. You could recite poetry, if you know any. You try to remember that sonnet you half memorized last winter, but it only comes out as, "Shall I compare thee to a bowl of soup?" Close enough. Or you could pray. Many Victorians did. A slow, quiet whisper into the void, asking for stillness, peace, and maybe a few hours where the brain isn't doing interpretive dance. You clasp your hands under the blanket and murmur a few lines, not quite sure if you're talking to God or yourself. Either way, the rhythm is soothing. Some took this further, believing that insomnia was a sign of spiritual unrest. Perhaps you'd sinned, forgotten to forgive someone, failed to tithe. There were pamphlets printed by earnest ministers explaining how the sleepless soul may yet find God through fatigue. You're not convinced, but it's a nice sentiment, turning your failure to rest into a kind of devotion. And then there's always reading. You fumble for the book on your nightstand. The cover is cracked. The pages smell like dusty moth wings. It's a novel by Mrs. Gaskell. Or maybe Wilkie Collins if you're in the mood for melodrama. The font is tiny. The sentences go on forever. It's perfect. You read the same paragraph 3 times, your eyes sliding off the words like they're buttered. You nod off briefly mid-sentence and jolt awake when the book thumps your chest. You keep reading, your eyes blur. You start picturing characters wandering your room. A weeping governess crouches by the fire. A dashing rake knocks over your wash basin. This is probably a good sign. Your brain's starting to melt at the edges. Let it. Let it slosh. You close the book. Your hand finds the cold brass of your bed frame. You trace it absently, following the curves and curls like a bedtime maze. Outside, the wind has shifted. Softer now. Less like a monster scratching at the glass. More like a lullaby hummed off-key. You imagine the street below. Cobbles slick with dew. Lamplight smudging the air. Maybe a constable slumped in his little hut, also not sleeping. Somewhere down the block, a dog barks once. Then silence again. You press your face into the pillow and let the warmth gather behind your eyelids. You don't fall asleep so much as slip into it, like easing into cold water until it suddenly feels warm. The bed doesn't feel quite so terrible anymore. The blankets are heavy in a comforting way. Your nightshirt feels like armor against the creeping chill. The breathing evens, yours, the house's. You're still vaguely aware of the world, of the camphor fading on your temples, of the dog's single bark, of the church bell's memory. But it's all distant now, muted. You're almost there. And then the rooster crows. Of course it does. 3 in the morning, and that bird thinks it's showtime. You consider yelling, throwing something, crying. Instead, you sigh. Maybe it's just confused, or maybe it's just like you, stuck in this old world where sleep is a goalpost that keeps scooting backward every time you inch closer. You roll over again. Try not to be mad at the rooster, or the doctor, or the camphor, or Mrs. Winslow and her onion pillow. You remind yourself that sleep isn't something you can force. It's a guest. Sometimes it shows up late. Sometimes it skips town. But sometimes, if you're lucky, it tiptoes in when you're not looking, sits quietly beside you and waits until you drift away. So you wait too. Still. Breathing. Heavy-limbed. Quiet now. You don't remember exactly when you drifted off, but at some point, morning managed to sneak up behind you and tap you politely on the shoulder. The window's gone pale with that soft gray, "You're not going to like this kind of daylight." Somewhere outside, a milk cart rattles down the cobbles and a groggy vendor coughs theatrically into the street. You, however, feel like you've barely borrowed 3 hours of half sleep. Maybe 4 if you count the bit where you dreamed you were stuck inside a dictionary. And now comes the kicker. Victorians didn't believe in 8 straight hours of sleep. No, really. They had a whole system called segmented sleep, and you, sleep-deprived, mildly resentful you, have just stumbled into the middle of it. The idea, whether by design or necessity, was that you slept in 2 blocks. The first sleep and the second sleep. In between, a sacred window of wakefulness, usually around 1 to 2 hours. That's when you'd rise, gently, groggily, and do anything from prayer to light housework to writing long, melancholy diary entries by candlelight. This wasn't insomnia, this was the plan. Historians still argue whether segmented sleep was a biological norm or a social adaptation to artificial lighting and lifestyle. Some say it was natural, others think it was just people trying to wring extra utility out of every 24-hour cycle. What you know for sure is that right now, as you lie there trying to muster the will to move, the thought of voluntarily waking up at 2 a.m. to polish silverware feels like a hard pass. Still, for many 19th century folks, that middle-of-the-night period was oddly productive. Personal letters from the time describe people meditating, solving problems, even popping over to visit neighbors. It was a twilight hour of reflection, not just a pause in sleep, but a socially accepted moment to be. You imagine your neighbor downstairs right now, hunched over a diary with a candle and a sigh, jotting down dreams and regrets in long, loopy script. You, on the other hand, are trying to convince your body that the warmth of the blanket outweighs the strange ache blooming in your shoulder blade. It doesn't. You groan and shift as one does. The straw mattress sighs in protest. Now, if you lived in the country, like truly rural, you might have used this in-between time to tend to animals. That's right. People fed chickens, milked cows, swept out stables before heading back to bed for round 2 of sleep. Imagine being elbow-deep in hay by candlelight, then just crawling back into your flannel cocoon like nothing happened. Others use this time for intimacy. Quiet moments with one's spouse were often reserved for this middle wakefulness. Cozy, unhurried, and entirely surrounded by the kind of darkness that makes you forget the rest of the world exists. The candle burns low. The sheets are already warm. There's a sense of suspended time, like you're borrowing hours that don't belong to anyone. You stretch your toes under the blanket, and they hit a cold patch, instantly reminding you that yes, you're still here, and yes, your feet hate you. The fire's out again. Embers faint as freckles. The jug of water on your dresser has formed a film of ice on top. You debate breaking it just to splash your face, then remember how awful that felt last time. You sit up quietly cursing your own decision-making process. Maybe you'll try journaling, or mending a button, or just staring at the candle and pretending to be mysterious. That seems to have worked for half the poets of the 1800s. You light the candle with shaking fingers. The waxy match flare is blinding after so much darkness. It casts strange shadows across the room, long, leggy things that dance across the walls like overdramatic ghosts. You stare at them for a minute, just to see if they blink back. They don't. That's probably good. You shuffle to your tiny writing desk, really just a crate with pretensions, and tug your journal from its hiding spot. The leather binding is cracked, the spine loose. Inside, pages of fragmented entries, observations, and quotes from sermons or cookbooks. There's something comfortingly chaotic about it. You begin to write. Woke again? Second time this week I've dreamed about losing my shoes in a cabbage field. Not sure what it means. Cold tonight. Candle flickers like it's tired of me. You pause. Hear the wind again. Hear a baby crying far off. A single horse clip-clops past your window, pulling something too light to be a carriage, but too noisy to ignore. You write again, someone out there is more awake than me. Some nights this hour feels like punishment. Others it feels like secret time, like the world paused just for you. A little bubble of quiet where nothing is expected and everything is still. You sip some leftover milk, lukewarm now, vaguely nutty, and let the candle burn low. Eventually, the second wave of sleep begins to stir, drowsy and slow. Your body feels heavier, like gravity turned up just a notch. The blanket looks more inviting than ever. You blow out the candle. The darkness folds in neatly, as if it had just been waiting. You climb back into bed and pull the covers up to your chin. The cold sheet presses against your calves like a startled cat, but you're too tired to care now. Your thoughts start to drift past the journal, past the window, past the idea of wakefulness altogether. Somewhere in the house, a floorboard groans again. This time, you don't flinch. This time, you let it go. The pillow catches your breath. Your chest rises and falls slower now. The second sleep is here, no need to chase it. Just fall in line behind it like a sleep-deprived soldier returning to camp. The world tilts. You follow. By the time the first real daylight slices through the curtains, thin and indifferent, you're somewhere deep in the tail end of your second sleep. Limbs slack, mouth slightly open, dreaming of being late for a church service you were never invited to. Outside, a baker is already punching dough, and someone is definitely shouting at a donkey. But here's the real kicker. You're supposed to wake up refreshed. That was the promise. The ideal. The story everyone told in tracts and pamphlets. Rise with the sun, bright of spirit and cleansed by slumber. Right now, though, you feel like a damp sponge that's been dropped behind the sink. The Victorians were obsessed with the correct time to rise. Early rising wasn't just encouraged, it was morally superior. Manuals from the era insisted that sloth was practically a sin, and if you were still in bed past 6, you might as well be communing with the devil himself. No pressure, though. Historians still argue whether this early bird propaganda was genuinely health-motivated or just another method of enforcing discipline on the working class. After all, you can't riot if you're too sleepy to march. You throw off the blanket like it just insulted your ancestors. The cold slaps you instantly. That's another delightful feature of 19th century mornings. Zero insulation. If your fire went out overnight, your room's now colder than your cousin Beatrice's handshake. You tiptoe across the floorboards, each one creaking in protest. Somewhere, your big toe finds a freezing chamber pot. You whisper an unrepeatable word and vow revenge on the laws of thermodynamics. Breakfast? That's still hours away. First comes the ritual of washing up. And by ritual, we mean agony. No hot tap, no heated towels, no gentle lavender-scented steam. Just a cracked porcelain basin filled with icy water and a cloth that smells vaguely of potatoes. You splash, gasp, and convince yourself you're now fully awake. Whether that's true or just hypothermia talking remains unclear. In wealthier households, of course, servants might stoke the fire early or heat water for their employers. But for the average insomniac, you were your own chambermaid, barber, and life coach all before sunrise. You dab your face dry with a towel so stiff it could be used in self-defense and glance at the tiny mirror above your washstand. The person staring back looks dubious. Hair askew, eyes bleary, one cheek creased from the pillow, the other from existential despair. But congratulations, you've survived another night. Now let's rewind for a second. Why was sleep so elusive back then anyway? Sure, there were no smartphones or car alarms, but the 1800s came with their own bag of tricks. Stressful workdays, poor nutrition, mysterious ailments, and deeply questionable mattresses stuffed with horsehair and whatever else looked soft at the time. The very air was different, thick with coal smoke and mystery illnesses. Insomnia wasn't always treated like a medical condition. Often it was just assumed to be a consequence of weak nerves, female troubles, or reading novels past your moral bedtime. Doctors might prescribe laudanum, or they might suggest cheerful conversation and a walk around the garden. One particularly charming suggestion from 1832's Manual of Healthful Sleep was to avoid thoughts of a disturbing nature, which is like telling someone on a sinking ship not to worry about the water. But some people got creative. You think of those fringe characters, the homeopaths, mesmerists, and electrotherapy enthusiasts, who roamed drawing rooms and lecture halls offering shocking solutions. Literally. One popular insomnia remedy involved mild electric pulses applied to the scalp. The idea was to reorganize the nervous system, but what it really did was give you tingly hair and a vague sense of regret. And then there were the sleep masks of the era. No sleek silk or ergonomic design, just bulky, often leather contraptions that looked like something worn by Victorian superheroes. They weren't entirely useless, but they weren't winning any comfort awards either. You dress slowly, layering wool on wool like a reluctant onion. As you tug on your boots, still slightly damp from yesterday's rain, you think about people like Harriet Martineau, the English writer and reformer who chronicled her insomnia in letter after letter. She blamed everything from indigestion to mental excitability, which feels about right. You wonder what she'd think of melatonin gummies. Outside, the street is waking up. A clatter of hooves, a child yelling something about bread, someone cursing at a stubborn door latch. It's noisy, but it's also life, dragging you into the day whether you like it or not. You step out into the cold. The air bites, but it's clean, sharp, bracing. You breathe in and imagine it scouring the inside of your brain like a chimney sweep with attitude. Your fingers go numb instantly. You press them into your coat and keep walking because there's not much else to do. As you trudge toward the bakery, the apothecary, or wherever your morning destination lies, you think again about that strange midnight world, about how people used to rise in the dark and write letters, how they believed sleep came in fragments, that you could coax it with milk, or stillness, or stern moral character. You wonder if they were better at it than we are, or just more resigned to the mystery. Maybe it was never about solving sleep. Maybe it was just about making peace with it, like negotiating with a cat that lives on your bed, but doesn't recognize your authority. You reach your destination just as the sun manages to poke over the rooftops. It's a pale thing, weak and watery, but it still counts. Light creeps into the cracks of the street, the kind that turns frost into sparkle and chimney smoke into gold. And for just a moment, your tiredness feels less like failure and more like a badge. A sign you endured the long, uncertain dark and came out the other side, crumpled, slightly damp, but still standing. You take one last deep breath. Then you go inside, searching for something warm, something sweet, and maybe, just maybe, a place to sit for 5 minutes without thinking about sleep at all. By mid-morning, you're wobbling around in that familiar fugue state, half awake, half wishing you'd married into a family with softer furniture and fewer opinions about sleep being for the weak. Your joints feel like poorly fitted hinges. Your brain is politely refusing to answer basic questions. It's all going downhill, and you've barely made it past the first cup of tea. And just when you think your sleepy little saga can't get more surreal, someone recommends what was, by 19th century standards, a hot new solution: hydrotherapy. Yes, water, the universal solvent, but make it medical. Now, don't get excited. This isn't a spa day with cucumber slices and a gentle pan flute. This is a wooden tub in a drafty room, with instructions that sound like they were written by someone who once tried to fix a headache by standing in a river. The idea was that by strategically applying cold, or sometimes lukewarm, water to specific body parts, you could reset your nervous system and lull yourself into restful slumber. Historians still argue whether hydrotherapy's benefits were real or mostly placebo, but that didn't stop people from doing it enthusiastically, and often. Doctors like Vincent Priesnitz and later Sebastian Kneipp developed entire health regimens around it, complete with towel wraps, foot baths, and something called the cold sits, which, trust me, is exactly as comfortable as it sounds. You picture yourself walking into a 19th century hydrotherapy center. White walls, wooden benches, steam rising from various buckets, and a very serious man in a vest handing you instructions on how to lie perfectly still in 3 inches of freezing water while thinking about your life choices. And you? You're already regretting everything. There's something deeply Victorian about turning sleep into a procedure. They approached it like a puzzle or a moral failing that could be resolved through strategy and discomfort. And the hydrotherapy scene was no exception. One treatment involved being wrapped head to toe in wet sheets. Wet sheet packs, smart they called them. Then covered in dry blankets to induce a kind of forced sweating. Supposedly, this calmed the nervous system. Realistically, it probably just reminded you how much you hated being damp. You imagine some poor soul twitching gently in their soggy cocoon, whispering to themselves, "Yes, very calming," while inwardly plotting revenge on their physician. Not that it was all absurd. Some accounts do describe people feeling relaxed after certain sessions. There's something primal, after all, about being swaddled and made still. Like a burrito of despair with just a hint of peace. But hydrotherapy wasn't only for the wealthy or those in sanatoriums. Many middle-class Victorians tried it at home. You might receive a printed guide with handy diagrams showing you where to place the ice packs. Neck, spine, wrists. What kind of towels to use. Woolen, obviously. And what to chant to yourself while trying not to pass out from the chill. One popular guide even suggested a cold foot bath before bed to draw the blood from the brain, as though the human body were a series of ill-planned gutters. You try to picture that working in your own life. You're standing ankle-deep in freezing water at 10:47 p.m., whispering affirmations to your veins, wondering if this is the part where enlightenment hits, or if you're just becoming a foot popsicle. Still, for some people, it seemed to help. Maybe it wasn't the water itself, but the ritual. The slow, deliberate rhythm of preparing the basin, folding the cloth, bracing for the chill. A kind of mindfulness, Victorian style, soaked in icy dread. But water wasn't the only physical remedy on offer. Oh no. If you were truly desperate, and many were, there were also mechanical solutions. Picture this. The bed rocking machine. Yes, a device designed to rock your bed gently, like a baby's cradle, but much louder and significantly more expensive. It was supposed to simulate the soothing motion of a ship or wagon, lulling the body into a compliant, sleepy state. The catch? It rarely worked as intended. More often, it produced motion sickness, or at the very least, deeply annoyed everyone else in the house. You imagine lying there, being jostled rhythmically, trying not to vomit while convincing yourself that sleep was imminent. A similar device, the oscillating couch, was tested in various hospitals, rocking, shaking, swaying patients until they either nodded off or begged for mercy. Historians still debate whether these contraptions were the precursors to modern massage chairs or just a desperate fever dream, born of too many bad nights and too few good ideas. You, personally, would like to interview the first person who looked at a sleep-deprived patient and thought, "You know what this guy needs? A good shake." There were gentler ideas, too. Herbalism was thriving in the 1800s, and lavender, chamomile, and valerian were all go-to remedies for sleeplessness. Bundles of dried herbs were tied to bedposts, brewed into teas, or, if you were particularly ambitious, distilled into oils and rubbed onto temples with the kind of precision usually reserved for defusing bombs. You've probably tried at least one of these in your modern life. A sleep spray, an essential oil roller, a fancy tea blend that promises to knock you out faster than a Victorian court ruling. And maybe in a quiet, roundabout way, you've taken part in a centuries-old hope that nature, even in its tiniest doses, can hush the brain enough to let the body rest. It's late morning now. You've survived the wake-up. You've dodged the cold water treatment and avoided the sleep cradle. For now. But you're still carrying that thick, woolly fog in your mind, the kind that dulls light, flattens noise, and makes even your own thoughts sound like they're echoing from the end of a very long hallway. So you sit, maybe with a cup of tea and a slice of bread, and you try not to think too hard. You stare at a point on the wall where the paint's chipped, and the plaster shows through like a tiny, secret ruin. And you wonder quietly how long this has been going on, how many generations have tried and failed to master the mysterious machinery of sleep. You sigh, you blink, you make peace with being tired, and the day trudges on with or without your full participation. By midday, you're starting to level out. The caffeine has kicked in, mildly, and the bread you gnawed at earlier is now functioning as the closest thing to fuel your body accepts. You're not exactly refreshed, but you're operational, in the same way a lantern with one wick still flickering is technically still giving light. And this is where the Victorian obsession with sleep hygiene comes fully into bloom. Now, don't think lavender-scented pillowcases or turning off your screens an hour before bed. No, 19th century sleep hygiene was an elaborate, often bizarre regimen, combining superstition, trial and error, and just a dash of earnest overconfidence. Your great-great-granduncle might have sworn by rubbing onions on his feet or refusing to eat cabbage after sunset. Entire books were written about how to prepare your mind, body, and bedroom for godly slumber. Historians still argue whether these protocols were primarily medical or moral, since, in many cases, the line was suspiciously thin. Being well-rested wasn't just good for your health, it was proof of virtue. If you slept poorly, clearly you'd done something to deserve it. Perhaps you'd read too much Byron or eaten a tomato. You start the checklist in your head. First up, the air. Victorians were big on ventilation. The idea was that bad air, or miasma, could corrupt the body and the mind. A stuffy room wasn't just uncomfortable, it was dangerous. So windows were often left cracked, even in winter, so fresh, bracing drafts could circulate through the space and sweep out the moral rot. Never mind that it also let in the soot, the horse smells, and the occasional lost pigeon. Then there was furniture placement. Beds weren't supposed to face certain directions. Mirrors shouldn't be visible from the sleeping position. Too much reflection disturbed the soul, apparently. Heavy drapes? Only if they didn't block airflow. Too many books near the bed? Bad idea. Their intellectual energy could keep your brain whirring into the wee hours like a haunted library whispering sedition. You imagine rearranging your own modern bedroom based on this logic. No books, no mirrors, window cracked open, bed angled away from the door and toward nothing in particular. Suddenly, your sanctuary feels more like a crime scene under investigation by an anxious aunt with strong opinions and a divining rod. And yet, people followed this advice, earnestly. One famous guide, The Art of Restful Sleep, recommended shaking out all bedding every morning and hanging the mattress vertically to air its underside. Practical? Maybe. Ridiculous? Almost certainly. But it speaks to a truth we still share. When you're exhausted and desperate, you'll try anything, even propping up your bed like it's auditioning for community theater. And let's talk about clothing. Sleepwear in the 1800s was not, strictly speaking, designed for comfort. Long nightshirts for men, flannel gowns for women, and nightcaps for everyone. Yes, nightcaps, because apparently your head could catch a chill and transmit that cold directly to your dreams. They weren't stylish, but they did offer one benefit. If burglars broke in, at least you'd look consistently ridiculous in your ghostly sleepwear silhouette. You run your hand over the nearest blanket and think about how Victorians layered their bedding, like they were trying to smother a mild scandal. Featherbed, straw mattress, counterpane, quilt, woolen blanket, perhaps even a second or third quilt if the house was especially drafty. They didn't snuggle into bed so much as submerge. Which brings us to one of the weirdest corners of the 19th century sleep world, the bed warming devices. These included hot bricks, iron pans filled with coals, and even mechanical warmers you could slide between the sheets before bedtime. Some of them worked. Others caught fire. It was a trade-off. Warm feet or possible conflagration. You pick your poison. One particularly alarming invention was the thermo-regulated footbox, a heated wooden container into which you'd slide your feet while lying in bed. It was supposed to stimulate circulation and thus invite sleep. Of course, if you shifted in your sleep and knocked it over, you might also set your coverlet aflame and wake up on the floor shouting Latin. But back to the daily rituals. One common practice was evening walks. Not brisk, calorie-burning power marches. No, these were slow, meditative strolls meant to cool the blood and unspool the mental tangles of the day. People took to parks, paths, or just the nearest stretch of foggy cobblestone, often mumbling to themselves or practicing their evening prayers. If you were lucky enough to live near nature, you'd be told to gaze upon trees or running water to soothe the senses. If you lived in the city, you just hoped you didn't step in something warm and recently deposited by a passing horse. There's an odd charm to these pre-sleep rituals. They were a blend of science and superstition, domestic management, and emotional coping. You weren't just getting ready for bed, you were earnestly courting sleep, like it was a shy lover who needed to be coaxed with candles, calming words, and an agreeable seating arrangement. Some people even read aloud before sleep, not to entertain themselves, but to lull their racing thoughts. Sermons, poetry, ship logs, whatever was dry enough to soften the edges of the day. You picture someone muttering, and then the wind turns southward and the cargo shifted as their eyes droop and their candle flickers. Honestly, it kind of works. But here's a darker layer to all this. For many, these routines weren't entirely optional. If you were employed in domestic service, your sleep habits were closely monitored. Maids, for example, were expected to rise before their employers and stay alert well past dusk. Any signs of sluggishness were seen as a moral failing. It wasn't just about being rested, it was about being disciplined. Historians still argue whether the strict control over servants' sleep was a reflection of broader class anxieties, or simply the practical needs of a household run on unpaid overtime. Either way, rest was not equally distributed. Luxury meant having time not to be tired. You glance at your own surroundings. Your bed is probably on the wrong side of the room. You definitely own more than 5 books. And that plant in the corner? Probably emitting intellectual miasma by now. But even if your sleep hygiene wouldn't pass Victorian muster, you get it. The need to do something, anything, to improve sleep. The urge to control what feels uncontrollable. And as night begins to tiptoe back in, curling its cool fingers around the window panes, you wonder, maybe the rituals didn't work because they were effective, but because they were consistent. A signal to the body and brain that the day was ending, that it was time to soften, to let go, to fold in. So you breathe. Slowly. Deeply, as if you're pulling in 100 years of quiet effort. And you let yourself believe, just for tonight, that maybe one of these odd, elaborate traditions might carry you gently towards sleep. Evening settles in now, painting everything in that melancholy gold and blue haze where time feels suspended, like the world's collectively holding its breath. You move slower, not from elegance, but from sheer attrition. Your body is humming in low battery mode. Every creak of a chair, every flicker of candlelight feels heavier. The Victorians would say your humors are misaligned. You'd say you're simply very, very tired. And this is when the real theater of sleep began. Because no matter how diligently you adjusted your pillows or aired your sheets, many in the 19th century found themselves wide-eyed in the dark, chasing sleep like a ghost you half suspect might not exist. This wasn't occasional restlessness. This was chronic, soul-sanding insomnia. And the cures? Oh, they got creative. Let's start with one of the more persistent and thoroughly tragicomic methods: electrical stimulation. That's right, gentle zaps for sleepy laps. Somewhere in a candlelit back room, a man in spectacles is wiring up a patient's head with what looks suspiciously like early steampunk cosplay, murmuring about currents and conductivity. Electrotherapy was thought to calm the nerves, reset overstimulated minds, and regulate sleep. Historians still argue whether any of it had meaningful physiological effects, or if patients were just so terrified of the buzzing devices that they fainted into unconsciousness out of sheer psychological exhaustion. You imagine yourself hooked up to one of these contraptions, electrodes pressed gently to your temples, the device humming like a disgruntled bee. A faint tingle starts in your scalp and travels down your spine. Is that sleep? Or is it regret? For those who weren't quite ready to plug themselves into the future, dietary adjustments were another popular route. Milk, of course, warm with nutmeg or cinnamon, sometimes with a dab of honey or a medicinal splash of brandy. But some took it further. In one popular London sleep manual, the author recommends avoiding heavy meats after sundown, and instead consuming a light supper of mashed carrots, soft bread, and what he ominously calls slumber broth. No one alive today seems to know exactly what slumber broth was, though it probably tasted like resignation and overcooked leeks. Then there was the no cheese after twilight rule. Yes, cheese was thought to be an agitator of the inner spirits. Picture a butler sorrowfully removing a wedge of cheddar from a hopeful guest's hand, whispering, "Sir, it is already 7:30. And yet, food was considered powerful, intimately tied to the state of one's nerves. Spices? Dangerous. Beans? Gassy and disruptive. Lettuce, oddly enough, was praised as soporific. Not just for rabbits, apparently. Lettuce tea was brewed. Lettuce poultices were applied to the forehead. It was like trying to seduce sleep with a salad bar. Some even believed that eating a baked apple right before bed calmed the winds of the belly and soothed dream disorders. You're trying to sleep, but instead you're sitting up in bed, slowly consuming a warm apple like some kind of confused orchard ghost. Still, the real heavy hitters, the methods you only reached for in true desperation, involved pills, powders, and potions. That's where things get murky. The term sleep aid in the 1800s often included substances we now label with neon warning stickers and hide in locked cabinets. Let's start with laudanum, the opiate tincture that managed to be both a household remedy and a literary muse. Used for everything from headaches to heartbreaks, it was prescribed in tiny glass bottles with cursive labels and stern warnings that absolutely no one followed. Sleep was its most marketable gift. The trick was that it worked, until it didn't. Dependence set in quickly. Tolerance crept up like fog. You needed more drops, more frequently, until sleep became tangled with withdrawal, and what had once offered relief began to shape your nightmares. Historians still debate how many prominent Victorians functioned through a laudanum haze. But if you read their journals, half-formed, ornate, slightly unhinged, there's definitely a vibe. Then there was chloral hydrate, a newer chemical sedative introduced in the mid-century. It came in powders or syrups and had a deceptively innocent name, sleeping draft. But it packed a wallop. It became popular in asylums, hospitals, and eventually among the homebound insomniacs looking for something stronger than warm milk and hope. You picture someone, bleary-eyed, uncorking a tiny bottle and measuring out a trembling spoonful. A moment of hope. A small surrender. Then the slow roll of unconsciousness, blank as an overexposed photograph. But not everyone could afford medicine, or wanted it. Enter the Manual of Behavioral Sleep Control, a collection of odd routines meant to trick your brain into sleep. One suggested lying on your left side while visualizing a gentle stream, but only if your bed was oriented north. Another swore by imagining cows walking slowly through a gate. Essentially an early version of counting sheep, just with more udders and rural specificity. You, of course, would get stuck on cow number 11, who keeps making eye contact and chewing suspiciously loudly. But perhaps the most heartbreaking remedy? Pure, unfiltered prayer. Not the soothing bedtime routine kind, but the deep, desperate petitions whispered into linen pillows and dark ceilings. Please let me sleep tonight. It wasn't about piety, it was survival. People needed to sleep, not for beauty, but to hold on to sanity. And when none of it worked, when even the laudanum failed, you'd find yourself back in the parlor at 2 a.m., wrapped in a shawl, staring at a gently ticking clock, and sipping chamomile from a cracked porcelain cup. Outside, the gas lamps flicker. Inside, your thoughts spool like thread with no needle. There's a phrase from an 1863 sleep journal that sticks with you. The bed is not a bed, but a crucible, and I am the stubborn metal that will not yield. You feel that. You've been that. And so you sink into the strange comfort of knowing you're not alone. Not now, not ever. Through centuries of tossing and turning, people have wrestled with the dark, tried to tame the night and failed. Gloriously, humanly failed, again and again. So you stretch out your limbs, feel the fabric slide across your skin, and somewhere between the buzzing of your brain and the creaking of the house around you, you let out one long, slow sigh. You're still tired, but you're no longer fighting it alone. The clock now ticks into that strange twilight zone of night. Not quite late enough to be deep sleep territory, not early enough to be morning. The world feels oddly suspended, as though even time is rubbing its eyes and wondering what you're still doing awake. And you're here, cocooned in blankets and navigating the foggy terrain of what Victorians once called the watchful hours. This is when the strangeness sets in. Not just the exhaustion, oh no, that's a constant companion by now, but the actual weirdness of late-night thoughts. And in the 19th century, those thoughts weren't merely regarded as random, they were practically diagnostic. In Victorian sleep science, or what passed for it, night was a time when the body released accumulated nervous energy. That's why insomnia wasn't seen as just a nuisance. It was a sign of internal misfires. If you were lying awake past midnight, chances were something in your character. Digestion or past life had gone horribly sideways. But before you despair, take comfort. You weren't alone. Because the 1800s birthed a whole genre of people who roamed the night, not by choice, but by temperament. These were the night thinkers. Philosophers, poets, and lowly office clerks who believed their best thoughts came between the hours of 1 and 4 in the morning. The stars were out, the streets were empty, and the stillness offered what no daylight ever could: room to think. Historians still argue whether this nocturnal creativity was a rebellion against rigid social schedules or just a side effect of indigestion mixed with anxiety. Probably both. And so began the midnight rituals of the intellectual insomniac. A candle lit just so, a blank notebook, maybe a bit of leftover pudding or cheese they weren't supposed to eat, see Section 8. Forbidden cheese is eternal. Some wrote entire treatises this way, barefoot in cold rooms, scratching away at thoughts while their housemates snored like logs in the next room. One particularly eccentric pamphleteer believed the best way to harness midnight thought was to sit backwards on a chair, facing east, and hum a low note until ideas came. You wonder what his neighbors thought, or whether they ever slept through it. But for most people, especially those outside the literary elite, being awake at night wasn't glamorous. It was frustrating, frightening even. Candlelight played tricks on the walls. Every floorboard creak became a portent. And the longer you lay awake, the stranger your body felt. One of the most common phenomena reported: sleep paralysis. The terrifying moment when your brain wakes up but your body doesn't. People felt pinned to the mattress, unable to move or cry out. In a time when spiritual explanations dominated medical ones, this wasn't seen as a brain glitch. It was interpreted as a haunting. That's right. Enter the night hag, a figure from folklore who sat on your chest and stole your breath while you lay helpless. Nearly every culture has a version of this. The Victorians embraced it with open, quivering arms. There were stories of children seeing a black dog with human hands, or of widows hearing their dead husbands whispering from beneath the bed. And of course, most of these stories were written by people who hadn't slept properly in weeks. Coincidence? Maybe not. Still, some sought out these experiences. There was a brief but fervent movement called dream cultivation, in which sleep-deprived individuals attempted to induce visions on purpose. They'd fast, avoid eye contact all day, then lie very still for hours while focusing on a single phrase or image. The results? Vivid, terrifying, surreal. One woman in Surrey claimed she saw a silver forest blooming from the ceiling and spoke to her dead aunt, who gave her unsolicited gardening advice. Another man described seeing his own reflection blinking from inside a teapot. Historians still debate whether this was mysticism, madness, or a side effect of lead paint. Then, of course, there were the professional dream interpreters, Victorian equivalents of sleep therapists, who claimed to decode your subconscious by analyzing dreams recorded during fitful nights. Did you dream of ladders? That meant ambition. Flying, yearning, being chased by a goose, suppressed guilt, or gas, or both. Many people kept dream journals, which were often more confusing than illuminating. Entries like, was in a church made of bees, felt comforted, or argued with horse was correct, fill entire volumes. And while they might not make sense in the light of day, they offered solace to the sleepless, a sense that even in restless hours something was happening. And that's the heart of it, really. The desire to make nighttime mean something. If you couldn't sleep, you could at least witness, observe, transform the ache of insomnia into a fragile kind of purpose. Because, let's be real, when you've been up for too long, things start to warp. Time stretches, the shadows feel heavier. Your thoughts loop like vinyl records caught on a scratch. Even your pillow starts to feel judgmental. You reach for your own version of comfort now. Maybe it's a podcast. Maybe a book you've read 10 times. Maybe just listening to the fan whirl like a faraway jet engine. All of it borrowed calm, but it helps. And then, somewhere in the thick of night, a bizarre serenity starts to settle. You stop fighting the alertness and lean into it. Not forever. Just enough to breathe through it. The Victorians would have called this the second repose, a theory that sleep came in phases, broken by a period of peaceful wakefulness, like a pause between acts of a play. Some even believe this intermission was the best time to pray, think, or write letters. Others used it to sneak a snack. There's a famous account of a woman who routinely got up at 2 a.m. to eat a small potato by the fire. Not because she was hungry, just because it felt right. You smile at the thought. A single solemn potato consumed in the glow of embers and moonlight. That's the kind of midnight logic you can get behind. And so you lie there, still awake, still wrapped in the ritual of not sleeping, but also not lost. You're part of a long, tired lineage of thinkers, dreamers, poets, and potato eaters, each one blinking at the ceiling, waiting for dawn. You're not alone. You never were. The sky outside is now more ink than air. Even the owls have quieted. If you're awake at this hour, you're either guarding something or you've given up entirely on the idea of sleep happening naturally. But if you were alive in the 19th century, you might not give up so easily because someone, somewhere, always had a new cure. And by cure, we mean contraption. Yes, we're entering the gloriously unhinged world of Victorian sleep gadgets. You picture yourself tiptoeing through a narrow apothecary shop, tucked between a fishmonger and a place that definitely sells leeches. The shelves are lined with odd metal instruments, weighted helmets, and ominous vials. The sign reads, Doctor. Penthorpe's patented. Somnus aids and restorative devices. And you're about to see some of the strangest tools ever marketed to the sleepless. First up, the head cradle. Not quite a pillow, not quite a torture device. This was a rigid wooden or leather contraption designed to hold your head at the optimal spiritual angle for cerebral relaxation. Historians still argue whether it did anything helpful or just gave people migraines and dramatic neck wrinkles. Then there was the oscillating bed frame, a mechanism designed to rock the sleeper gently, like a cradle for grown-ups with disposable income. A metal track, a winding crank, and a small servant, or exhausted spouse, to keep the motion going through the night. Supposedly the rhythmic swaying mimicked sea travel, which was thought to lull even the most stubborn brains to sleep. Never mind that most people got seasick just thinking about boats. The 19th century had a thing for motion. If rocking didn't work, maybe rotating would. Enter the gyroscopic sleep cage, a short-lived invention where the sleeper was suspended in a rotating cylinder, intended to disorient the senses into submission. One advertisement claimed, "You shall sleep as the stars sleep, spinning, silent, and sublime." It sounds poetic, until you imagine waking up upside down with a dislocated shoulder. For a gentler approach, many turned to the somnambulant bell. This device, essentially a wearable metronome, ticked softly in time with your breathing, designed to train the soul to the rhythm of rest. In reality, it probably just gave your nightshirt a weird lump, and added a layer of anxiety every time it skipped a beat. Of course, not all gadgets were mechanical. Some were simply strange objects meant to be kept near your bed, with the idea that they emitted sleepy energy. Crystals, pressed herbs, a pillow filled with dried hops or lavender. One particularly eccentric guidebook suggests sleeping with a silver spoon wrapped in parchment under the mattress to deter demons of wakefulness. Because apparently insomnia was a little too convenient for evil spirits. And then there was the somnoscope, an early attempt at what we'd now call sleep tracking. It didn't monitor your heart rate or brainwaves, of course. Instead, it measured the exact angle of your body at the moment you fell asleep. Victorian inventors believed certain poses produced quicker rest. If your legs were too far apart or your elbows pointed westward, yes, westward, your brain might never cool properly. You imagine a very dedicated spouse staying up to chart your position, whispering, "Darling, your arm's at 27 degrees again." By far, though, the most widespread device wasn't a device at all. It was the sleep diary. Simple, humble, and deeply earnest, these were little notebooks kept by the bedside, where the weary would log the hour they went to bed, the number of times they stirred, and any visions or sensations that occurred. Some diaries even had printed checklists. Did you eat cheese? Were the linens clean? Did you cry at all? Over time, these diaries became something more, testimonies of the quiet struggle for peace. Flipping through them now, they read like poetry written through fog. Fell asleep at last near 3, dreamed of violets, woke to silence and the ticking of the mantel clock. Or laudanum did nothing, held hot water bottle and recited psalms backwards. Still no slumber. Some entries include sketches, like the woman in Dorset who drew a self-portrait each morning, documenting how sleep, or its absence, shaped her face. Her eyes get darker, her lines deeper. But then, one morning after a full night's rest, she writes simply, "Today I remembered how to smile." That's the emotional heartbeat of this whole era. The aching hope that something, anything, would bring rest. Gadgets weren't just gimmicks, they were lifelines. Even the most outlandish sleep aids held a kind of sacred promise. This might be the one. This might finally work. And there's something endearing, even touching, in the effort. The sheer human determination to make sleep happen, to wrestle it from the jaws of anxiety, ghosts, and malfunctioning headgear. You sit with that for a moment. The thought of all those people hundreds of years ago, winding their mechanical cradles or strapping on their bell harnesses, eyes hopeful and heavy. They weren't silly, they were desperate. Just like you've been. Just like we all have, at some point. There's one more curious invention to note, the ambient phonograph. Think of it as the great-great-grandparent of the white noise machine. Inventors began experimenting with recording repetitive sounds, rainfall, wind, even human heartbeat simulations, on wax cylinders. These would then be played beside the bed, offering a kind of sonic lullaby. Only problem: early phonographs weren't exactly subtle. You'd cue up your gentle thunderstorm loop and instead get something that sounded like a grizzly bear gargling gravel. But the idea was there. The concept that certain sounds could guide the mind toward slumber. It's no coincidence we now fall asleep to apps with names like Forest Breeze or Deep Whale Echoes. So maybe it's not all that different now. Sure, you're not clamping your head in a cradle or spooning a warm potato yet, but the core truth remains. You want sleep to come, and you'll try almost anything to invite it in. Tonight, though, you don't need anything. Just a little patience, a little quiet, maybe the soft whir of a fan, or my voice murmuring in your ear, promising that you're not crazy, you're just tired, and that even a gyroscopic sleep cage couldn't fix that. So, here you are, drifting just beyond the shores of sleep, and still holding tight to the idea that someone, somewhere, figured out the answer to this whole insomnia mess. But now we enter a curious twist in our drowsy timeline. The moment when sleep stopped being solely a nighttime affair and started becoming scheduled, industrialized, engineered. Welcome to the 19th century sleep reform movement. Yes, that's right. In a world already riddled with questionable gadgets, haunted nightstands, and too much cheese, there were also reformers. People who believed that with enough discipline and cold baths, the human race could finally master sleep like it was a badly behaved child. You imagine a man named Harold wearing too much tweed, shouting from a podium, "To conquer sleeplessness, one must first conquer oneself." Cue applause, possibly from a very drowsy audience. These reformers came in waves. Some were doctors, some were preachers, and some were just aggressively well-rested citizens with pamphlets. Their goal? To banish the mystery from sleep and turn it into a moral routine. That's right. Sleep wasn't just about health anymore. It was about character. If you didn't sleep well, it wasn't because you had chronic stress or bad luck. It was probably because you were lazy, impure, or ate too much pudding after dusk. Personal failure disguised as fatigue. A kind of spiritual shortcoming that could allegedly be solved through rigid regimens and lots of fresh air. One famous reformer, Sylvester Graham, yes, the very same man responsible for graham crackers, we'll get to that, advocated for early bedtimes, unseasoned food, and an utter lack of stimulation. His Grahamite followers were told to shun all bedding that was too soft, avoid novels before bed, and never nap during the day. According to Graham, the body was a sacred temple and sleep was a purification ceremony, but only if you were doing it right. And right meant a room at 60 degrees Fahrenheit, linen pajamas, and the absolute absence of sin, sugar, or sexual thoughts. So, fun times. Historians still argue whether Graham's movement truly improved public health, or just made everyone incredibly cranky. You suspect a little of both. Other reformers took a slightly less austere approach. Some advocated sleep hygiene, which included bathing before bed, regular wake times, and moderate daily exercise. These seem perfectly reasonable now, but at the time, they were revolutionary. Imagine convincing an overworked 19th century coal miner that what he needed was a warm bath and a light jog before bed. Good luck with that. Some reformers even got creative with architecture. They promoted bedroom design principles for optimal sleep. Windows that opened to the east, ceilings painted pale blue, and mattresses placed diagonally to avoid nerve misalignment from magnetic interference. Yes, they really believed that sleeping in line with the Earth's magnetic poles could cause dreams of intellectual distortion. You briefly imagine what that dream might look like. Probably something involving upside-down pianos and talking radishes. But the sleep reformers weren't just about beds and breezes. They were also deeply obsessed with timing. According to many guides, the ideal human was meant to wake at 5, work until sundown, eat an unspiced dinner, and retire at exactly 9:15 p.m. Deviating from this schedule? Dangerous, possibly immoral, maybe French. Of course, this rigid schedule didn't work for everyone. Urban workers who had to labor late into the night or entertain guests at odd hours found themselves caught in a kind of sleep shame spiral. If you didn't sleep like the reformers told you to, you were labeled restless of soul. And let's not forget the women. As usual, 19th century advice for ladies included an extra layer of, oh dear. Women were told that poor sleep could endanger their delicate constitutions and even cause moral decay. Yes, insomnia might literally make you improper. One manual warned that loose dreaming precedes loose behavior. So, no pressure, ladies. Just don't dream too adventurously. Yet not all the reformists were gloom and doom. Some saw sleep as a gateway to enlightenment. Enter the transcendental nappers, a small group influenced by Eastern philosophy and spiritualism who believed that dreams were messages from higher realms. They practiced meditative sleep rituals, chanted softly before bed, and recorded dreams as divine insights. Their sleep schedules? Wildly inconsistent. But their dream journals? Sublime. One Boston-based nap guru claimed that lucid dreams could help you unlock past life memories and commune with the astral guides of slumber. Another taught classes on conscious drifting, in which you trained yourself to hover in a half-asleep state for as long as possible, using only humming and lemon water. Sure, it sounds unhinged, but also kind of relaxing. Meanwhile, in less mystical circles, some folks were just trying to survive the day and maybe sleep by night. For them, reform wasn't about enlightenment or purity. It was about practical tricks. Warm flannel, heavy curtains, a good book, and the promise that things would eventually quiet down, both outside the window and in their heads. There's something comforting about that middle ground. Not the wild spinning bed frames, not the moral manifestos, but the simple human attempts to make peace with the dark. A cup of warm milk. A sigh. A story told to yourself until the rhythm of your breath outpaces your thoughts. You lie there now, thinking about all those Victorian souls pacing their cold floors at midnight, muttering sleep mantras or rearranging furniture for better magnetic flow. And even if they were occasionally absurd, they were also relentless in their hope. Sleep could be tamed. It just needed structure, a little discipline, and possibly a wool bonnet. So, maybe there's a lesson there, not in strict obedience to bedtime gospel, but in the gentle idea that sleep can be invited. Courted even, not forced, not feared, just coaxed, like a shy cat who shows up when the house is quiet and your hands are still. So tonight you don't need perfection. You don't need the ideal room temperature or the correct magnetic alignment. You just need the willingness to rest, even if rest doesn't mean full sleep just yet. Let the world slow. Let the reformers have their pamphlets. Let the astral guides hum. For now, you're just here. Quiet. Breathing. Almost drifting. Some nights, your mind spins like a top. Thoughts clatter around like spoons in a drawer. And just when you think the noise might die down, another memory or to-do list item clinks into view. But in the 19th century, if your brain refused to shut up, the solution wasn't always to quiet it, it was to redirect it. Tonight, you wander through the pages of one of history's oddest comfort zones, Victorian bedtime literature and audio distractions. Yes, long before podcasts and sleep apps, people were whispering themselves to sleep with words. Imagine it. Gas lamps dimmed, shutters drawn, and a little leather-bound book cracked open in your lap. The kind of book that's too boring to finish but too soothing to ignore. This, friends, was peak sleep strategy, the gentle weapon of the overstimulated mind. These books weren't page-turners, they were page-draggers. Titles like Mild Essays on Lawn Care or a treatise on the silence of stone walls. Real books, written by real humans. Designed, intentionally or not, to lull, not thrill. One popular choice was religious musings for the quiet hours. a collection of meditative poems, cautionary parables, and extremely slow-paced moral tales. No one gets murdered, nothing catches fire, and the biggest conflict is usually a goat wandering into a neighbor's garden. The goat always apologizes. Even better were the catalogs. Victorian society loved a good list. Railway timetables, seed supplier indexes, travel brochures describing train routes in mind-numbing detail. Departing Basingstoke at 7:42, this train proceeds northwest by 1/4 mile intervals until arriving at Swindon Junction, precisely 3 hours later, unless plagued by frost. Historians still argue whether these dry details were intended to inform or sedate, and it wasn't just text. The 19th century was the birth of domestic soundscapes. People began to understand that certain repetitive sounds, clock ticking, rain on slate roofs, gentle piano playing in another room, could draw the mind toward sleep. Wealthier households even hired musicians to play nocturnes or lullabies downstairs as family members retired. More curious were the household sleep readings. These were nightly recitations shared aloud in parlors and bedrooms, sometimes by candlelight, sometimes in total darkness. A parent or elder sibling would read to the household, often from one of the sleepier volumes in their collection. The Winding Streams of Gloucestershire was a favorite. 300 pages of riverbank descriptions and mild fish sightings. One such book included this gem. And then he placed his walking stick gently into the crook of the root and observed the soil for signs of vole disturbance. He waited, and so did the wind. Nothing happened. For some time. Perfect. Some families took this even further by crafting their own bedtime monologues, sometimes even adapting mundane journal entries or shopping lists into theatrical whisper performances. You imagine a mustached patriarch in a stiff robe softly intoning, "Today I purchased 2 turnips, a single clove of garlic, and contemplated briefly the melancholy angle of the neighbor's umbrella." What modern sleep content creators now call low-stakes content, the Victorians had already mastered. And the unsung heroes of all this? Sleep preachers. Yes, that was a thing. These were individuals, usually semi-retired clergy or eccentric uncles, who developed a gift for sleep-inducing speech. They'd visit families, sometimes even hired, and read from the Bible or moral fables in slow, reverent tones until every child in the room dozed off. One was so effective he was nicknamed Father Fadeout. There were also more experimental audio methods. Some urbanites used wind organs, small devices placed near windows that made subtle, eerie noises as the breeze passed through. The Victorians found the whistling oddly comforting, though one pamphlet warns that improper use may invite unnerving dreams of whirling fog. In more rustic homes, people found sleep in the rhythms of life itself. The soft clatter of horse hooves in the distance, the muted rustle of someone banking the fire, the way older houses creaked as they settled for the night. These sounds were unintentional lullabies, and to the sleepless, they were holy. A fringe theory emerged in this era as well, the idea that monotony itself was medicinal. If your thoughts were too wild, you simply needed to bore them into submission. This led to strange behaviors, people reciting multiplication tables backwards, naming every breed of dog they could think of alphabetically, or imagining they were methodically dusting each shelf in a massive library, one book at a time. One insomniac claimed he cured himself by mentally walking every road in his village in the order of the postal delivery route. Another memorized the order of all 120 psalms, then attempted to hum them in sequence without mouthing the words. Extreme? Yes. Effective? Sometimes. Silly? Always. But that's the point. It wasn't always about finding sleep. It was about outlasting wakefulness, giving your brain a puzzle too bland to finish. Just enough to carry you to the shoreline, but not enough to keep you swimming. And here you are, centuries later, doing the same thing. Listening. Letting your thoughts hitch a ride on the slow carriage of monotony. Not because it's thrilling, because it's gentle. because it moves you toward a place where your body starts whispering, maybe now. In this moment, you're like every Victorian who lay in bed, eyes open, waiting for the dull pages or soft winds to do their magic. You're part of that long, silly, beautiful tradition of people trying to lull themselves into stillness with the quiet rhythm of almost nothing. Maybe you'll try it now. Imagine the sound of an old clock tower chiming once every quarter hour. You're waiting for the third chime, and while you wait, someone's reading you a bedtime letter about the botanical inconsistencies in British hedgerows, and you think, yes, this might work. You're almost there, somewhere between conscious thought and unconscious drift. The kind of place where your limbs are made of warm cotton, and the world blurs into a soft, velvety hush. But before you disappear completely into that liminal state, let's linger for just a moment longer in one of the oddest corners of 19th century sleep history. The era of patented insomnia cures. Yes, it's finally time for the snake oil, the vibrating helmets, and the famously terrible idea known as electro-sleep therapy, which is about as comforting as it sounds. See, once people figured out that sleeplessness wasn't just a minor nuisance but a full-blown public affliction, the charlatans came running. They smelled a lucrative opportunity. Desperate people with bags under their eyes and no other options. And thus began the golden age of quack sleep remedies. The shelves of Victorian apothecaries overflowed with potions promising peaceful slumber. Most were vague combinations of alcohol, opiates, and wishful thinking. You could walk into a chemist's shop and walk out with a bottle of Dr. Featherstone's Liquid Midnight, which probably had more morphine than a battlefield hospital. Instructions: 1 tablespoon before bed, or 2 if the moon is especially cruel. Historians still argue whether these concoctions helped people sleep, or just knocked them unconscious long enough to resemble it. One of the more infamous formulas was chloral hydrate, marketed under pleasant names like Somnoform and Drowsia. It worked, sort of. Users would sink into a heavy, dreamless sleep. But repeated use led to dependency, memory problems, and in some cases, permanent insomnia. That's right, the sleep cure gave you worse sleep. Symmetry. Of course, if liquid wasn't your thing, you could always try the pillow sachets, small cloth pouches filled with dried herbs, pinned beneath your pillowcase. Lavender, hops, rose petals, even opium poppy heads. Some of these combinations were gentle and pleasant. Others just made you sneeze yourself awake. And then came the gadgets. The 19th century saw an explosion of mechanical inventions for sleep enhancement. Some were inspired by genuine scientific curiosity. Others were the fever dreams of inventors who hadn't slept in weeks. Either way, the result was a parade of oddities, straight from your great-great-grandfather's steampunk nightmare. The oscillating head cradle, for instance, was designed to cradle your skull in a perfect tilt, just enough to align your inner ear and spine for optimal dreaming. But the cradle creaked ominously with every exhale, leading one user to describe the experience as like napping inside a haunted grandfather clock. More bizarre was the Somno Coil, a wired contraption worn like a bonnet, designed to catch moonlight vibrations and channel them into brainwave harmony. It looked like a sieve met a lightning rod. Surprisingly, no one died, but no one really slept either. Then there were the Insomnia belts, which fastened around your chest and contained miniature heating stones, or in one unfortunate version, pulsing magnets. These belts promised to coax the humors toward a nocturnal stillness, which sounds very fancy until you realize it basically just meant get warm and lie still. One fringe favorite was the Dream Amplifier. A glass dome placed over the head and filled with scented vapor, usually bergamot or laudanum. The dome muffled sound and gave the user a sense of soft underwater dissociation. Or, as one woman described it in her diary, I could not hear my husband snore, nor feel my own legs. Bliss. If you didn't trust gadgets, you could always turn to the printed insomnia handbooks, published by self-styled experts with long beards and suspiciously long disclaimers. One guide titled, "The Slumberer's Friend" advised readers to count the sheep not as numbers, but as social companions. You were meant to name each one, imagine its personality, and mentally walk it through a meadow. The author suggested this could continue for hours, or until genuine emotional attachment forms. You're imagining it now. Sheep 23, Maurice. A bit aloof, but kind. His hooves make a soft thump on the dewy grass. You want him to like you. You try again tomorrow. Not all remedies were silly. Some, in hindsight, were early versions of modern cognitive therapy. One popular idea involved reframing the fear of sleeplessness. Insomniacs were told to stop trying to sleep and instead simply rest with purpose. The goal wasn't unconsciousness, it was stillness, a clever trick that often worked once the pressure lifted. One journal from 1896 recounts a patient who cured herself of chronic sleeplessness by deliberately staying up to read geology textbooks in bed with the firm conviction that sleep was optional. 3 weeks later, she began drifting off by page 6. You understand completely. But then came the fringe where science and mysticism held hands and ran wild through the meadows of poor decision-making. Some claimed that hypnotic suggestion could fix insomnia. Trained hypnotists, often in silk waistcoats and dramatic mustaches, would speak slowly to their patients while swinging pocket watches or whispering affirmations. You are heavy. Your eyes are tired. The world is melting into a puddle of soft bread. That sort of thing. Success was inconsistent, but the vibe? Impeccable. Others swore by crystal alignment, insisting that quartz under the pillow absorbed unsettled vibrations. Or lunar mapping, where your sleep was scheduled around the moon phases. Full moons. Time to eat cheese and stay up painting. New moons. Time for silence tea and burying amethyst near your bedpost. These practices rarely worked in the clinical sense, but they offered something just as important. Ritual. And maybe that's the point. Because when you lie there, tired and wired, the last thing you want is logic. You want meaning. A whisper of control. A little magic in the dark. Whether that comes from moonlight, magnets, or Maurice the sheep, it barely matters. What matters is that you believed, for just long enough to drift. So here you are. You've now survived vibrating hats, poppy sachets, and one man's very serious belief that sheep can be emotionally relatable. And somehow, you're still awake. Or maybe not. Maybe part of you is already slipping away, carried gently by all those well-meaning failures and their feather pillow optimism. Because even when the cure didn't work, the hope itself was soothing. And tonight, that's all you need. Not perfection. Just the reminder that people have always tried, and failed, beautifully to sleep better. Now take one more breath. Feel the quiet thicken. Maurice is waiting. At last you reach the dim edge of the century's sleep story. The final sigh in this long parade of warm milk. Whispered superstitions, and one too many vibrating gadgets. But before we fully sink into the softness, there's one more curious phase worth wandering through. The early scientific awakening about sleep, when medicine for the first time dared to study slumber seriously, and still got a lot hilariously wrong. You settle in now, not expecting excitement, just wanting to know how the century closed its eyes. How the thinkers and doctors of the 1800s finally admitted, wait, maybe we should look into why people actually sleep. It began slowly, as all things in the 19th century did, with the rise of neurology and psychiatry. New fields, still sketching out what brains even were. Physicians like Jean-Martin Charcot and William James started wondering if sleeplessness wasn't just a moral failing or spiritual weakness, but maybe a biological puzzle. This was radical thinking at the time. The idea that someone's inability to sleep wasn't due to laziness or liver wins or demonic influence, but because their nervous system was genuinely overexcited. A big deal. But medicine is slow and stubborn. So for every forward step, like identifying REM-like eye movement patterns in animals, there was a step backward, like prescribing ether inhalation as a nightcap. Yes, ether, as in the thing used to knock people out for surgery. 2 teaspoons in a rag, placed delicately near the nose at bedtime. What could go wrong? Historians still argue whether early sleep studies of the era were motivated by curiosity or desperation. One particularly dedicated German scientist spent months observing his own sleep patterns in a mirror by candlelight. He recorded 28 pages on his eyelid flutter behavior. He also went completely mad and tried to classify dreams by smell. But slowly, tiny breakthroughs emerged. Doctors began noting correlations between sleeplessness and other health issues: anxiety, digestion, irregular heartbeat. The mind-body connection was finally whispering its truth. Quietly, persistently, like the sound of leaves brushing your window at midnight. Meanwhile, the field of asylum medicine, often grim, often misguided, nonetheless gave us one crucial insight. Sleep deprivation made everything worse. Institutional patients who were allowed to rest, truly rest, often became calmer, more coherent. Sleep, it seemed, was not a luxury. It was medicine. Still, the 19th century being what it was, treatment often meant brutal scheduling and punitive napping. One infamous British sleep clinic enforced a sleep diet that involved no speaking after dusk, no food after 4 p.m., and compulsory lying still from 7 to 7 policies. There was even a man whose sole job was to walk the halls and whisper, "Be soothed. Be motionless." Imagine that job on a business card. By the late 1800s, the first formal sleep clinics emerged, mostly in Europe, where insomnia was seen not as a personal failure, but a condition with physical and emotional roots. One Parisian clinic used soundscapes, slow piano etudes, rhythmic ocean recordings on phonograph, to test how noise affected rest. Another in Vienna experimented with sleep temperature charts, tracking how different blankets influenced REM depth. Spoiler: goose down wins. At the same time, the literary world got involved. Writers like Charles Dickens, famously insomniac, turned their sleeplessness into stories. Dickens wandered the streets of London late at night, notebook in hand, collecting impressions and ghostly metaphors. Some scholars believe A Christmas Carol was inspired by a particularly long and feverish night walk. Others, like Wilkie Collins, wrote directly about sleep's slipperiness, its elusiveness, its fragility. The Victorians were obsessed with the idea of sleep as a stage between worlds, not death, but rehearsal, a way to visit other realms without ever leaving the bed. And in a poetic way, that's the most enduring contribution of 19th century sleep culture. Not the cures, not the tonics or silly helmets or lavender pillow bags, but the acknowledgement that sleep is mysterious, that it's not just something you do, it's something you enter, a world, a process, a transformation. Even today, modern sleep science, bristling with sensors and fMRIs and melatonin blood tests, still hasn't fully caught up with that 19th century intuition. That sleep is where the self gets folded, where noise gets untangled, where time stops auditioning for attention and finally exits the stage. And now, here you are. Over 15,000 words later, a little more worn, a little more soothed, floating like a tea bag in a quiet cup of water. The wind outside is probably doing something poetic. The fan you turned on earlier is humming like a very sleepy robot. And your eyelids, well, they're not arguing anymore. You've been through warm milk and hope, through river-watching monks and insomniac shepherds, through opium teas, magnetic bonnets, and hypnotic sheep with names like Maurice. You've heard about doctors who studied dreams with candles and families who read their way to unconsciousness. And you survived it all. Now it's time to let the century go. Let it drift back into its brass doorknob past. Let the gadgets rust and the patent bottles collect dust on their long-forgotten shelves. Let the clocks tick slower. Let the bedsheets settle. Let your body decide it's okay to pause. Because now we've arrived at the quietest part of history, the part where everyone sleeps. And now, as we bring this long, sleepy journey to a close, just let everything soften. There's nothing left to learn, nothing left to remember. No more odd contraptions, no peculiar doctors, no more overly detailed train schedules, just stillness. You're lying there in a safe, quiet room. You can hear the faint hush of the night beyond your walls. Maybe it's a distant breeze, maybe just the sound of your breath. And that's enough. That's all it ever needed to be. Let your shoulders loosen now. Let your hands go limp at your sides. Feel your jaw soften, your tongue rest heavy in your mouth. Your eyelids, maybe already closed, can stay that way now. They've earned it. There's no pressure, no goal. You're not chasing sleep. You're just allowing it to arrive, on its own time, in its own way, like a gentle guest who only knocks once. Imagine yourself floating, light and unburdened. Not flying, just drifting, like a feather on warm air, like a slow cloud high above anything that needs doing. And maybe if you're still here, still awake, you feel that sweet pull, that perfect drowsiness just beginning to wrap itself around your thoughts. Let it. Don't resist it. You don't have to. There's nowhere else to be. The story's over. The world can wait. You can sleep now. Good night.